So I've got a little case study where I'm going to discuss the project that we've been doing over the last 6-8 months in Chicago, working with a large furniture manufacturer. The idea was that if we consider design as a process of creating meaning, as a semiotic morphism, and we look at what that implies in terms of selling products, we can think of the design itself as a form of information, and we can think of all of the information ecosystem that exists around the designs as an opportunity for improving the systems and services that the organization has in the market. If we think about design in general and go back to the 1960s with Herbert Simon, there he is at the chalkboard in the mid-1980s. You'll recall, most of you, that his description of design is about moving from the current situation to an improved situation. So design is a planning process, and it has this idea of a future direction towards improvement. So with that in mind, we understand that design is about construction of meaning. If things are being improved, it's not a neutral change, it's a change that has implications for how we understand. This change in the environment that design provides, it gives the organizations an opportunity to think about their product offering in a new and a different way, as a construction of meaning around development of new kinds of information. And then the question is, how can you take advantage of those new kinds of information as a way of attracting, maintaining, and in general contributing to the client relationship? In addition to this, we can think of information around products and services as providing a kind of dissonance reduction. So again, if we think of the designers as the people creating meaning, an important touch point in the process is after the client has already purchased the product or service. We have a terrific amount of choice in the world today, and often those choices are fairly equally balanced. There might only be a small difference between the things that we choose to bring into our lives and the ones that we set aside. And the closer that distance is, we know from psychology, the greater the cognitive dissonance, the greater the disturbance in your mind that persists about whether or not you've made the right choice. Because these choices were very close together, there's a possibility that you've made the wrong choice. So one of the places where the information design process can be brought explicitly into play is with this reduction of cognitive dissonance, which often takes place in the process after the people already have what they've purchased, but as a way of maintaining the client relationship, you can give them additional reassurance that what they've done is collected the correct thing. Is that making sense? Are we okay? The next thing is the information can strengthen the client relationship in other ways. So, for example, in this product, we spent some time looking at other business-to-business organizations and how they leverage in an intelligent or interesting way their information on behalf of the people that are using their clients, their products or services. So the information in this case might be information that they've already provided in some way, but is now being provided in a new way. Or it might be information that they don't currently have, but there's opportunities to start to collect or produce that kind of information, again with this kind of a goal in mind. So the 4 case studies that we looked at, the first one was a Midwestern United States distributor of food products. Farner Broken is their name. And their innovation was that they provided individualized price reports so that clients who would otherwise have to So this is in the business-to-business setting. So the first organization is selling to the second organization that's going to then sell to the client. So rather than make the second organization prepare all the retail information that has to go to the client, the first business, which already has that information, collects it up and makes it available in an easily accessible form to the people that are going to pass it along to the next one. So it's a way for strengthening that business-to-business client relationship across this information boundary. The second one, Stenograph. They're again a Illinois producer, and in their case, the business is court stenography. So a little bit like our simultaneous translators, in a legal setting. They have that person who's sitting and keeping track of everything that everybody says, and they've got to keep a very accurate record for it. So in their case, those people need to be insured because of their value to the legal system, and their work needs to be insured in case someone decides to protest what went into the record as being inaccurate. So in this case, what happens is the client, the second business, the stenography business, has all of the insurance documentation that's given to them at the time of the contract signing. But the business has taken that information and re-provided it so that you just have to quickly log in and you can find it. You can find your digital copy on their site as a way of making it more ready to hand. It's not a question of the second business having to sort of search through their files, find the correct documents. They already have that information, but the source organization is making it more easily accessible to them. In the third example, we have 3M, which you'll know primarily as a sort of office supply place. But they also have a medical branch. So in that instance, what they're doing is they provide each of their organizations produces a sort of a very immediate response to the key performance indicators of the organization. So if you've been following Mauricio's ICD project, one of the things that they've recently been doing is developing across all of the companies that are involved a set of indicators that are shared across multiple industries and provide a kind of a baseline measurement around innovation and performance and competitiveness. With the 3M organization, they've arranged that kind of reporting comes very quickly back to a central location and gets disseminated then out to all of the other parts of the organization, so that something that's working very well in one place can quickly be adopted by other organizations that are, or by other parts of the same organization. Another group that does this is the hamburger retailer, McDonald's. Several of the graduate students at our school have worked with them, and their model is that they franchise across however many million outlets around the world, but innovation takes place somewhere out in the periphery. So there will be one or two stores that will start to try something different, and the organization uses those as kind of test cases against the entire million operations. So if it works very well in some small town in Germany, then they can deploy it again and try it in some small town in Korea, or some small town in the United States, or wherever they are in the world, and reduce the risk of the organization by treating the almost experiments or case studies of these satellite retail outlets as places where innovation can happen and then be brought back and redisseminated. So that's a little bit what the 3M Medical Group is doing. Finally, Tesco, you'll know, is a British grocery store. And one of the things that they do is have a very good inventory control system. So this is getting a little bit closer to the work that we were doing up in Chicago, where the the organization already has this information, but by making it more dynamic and more readily accessible, they can feed more quickly back down their supply chain in a predictive manner, so they know here's something that's starting to sell quite quickly, and we can predict a week from now or 10 days from now that demand is going to ramp up. So they are able to more proactively send it back down to the supply chain and bring the materials that they're going to need into the retail outlets. So if we think of those then as a set of principles that you can apply to any organization, you've basically got provide the information services to the clients that if you didn't provide, they would have to produce themselves. So because it's simple and easy for your organization to produce that information, use it as a leverage with your clients rather than insisting that they go through the process of creating information that you've already got ready to hand. The second is to make the information that they've already got easier for them to find. So that's the example of those insurance policies. The third is to deploy organizational-wide key performance indicators, as you're now doing with the ICD project experiments, so that they become an accessible way of various parts of the organization communicating with others about what's working and what isn't. And again, as in ICD, establish a baseline so that improvement in the organization can be understood in terms that are more convincing because you've got a measurement in place. Very difficult process to set those up. Finally, feed the relevant information that you can get as quickly as possible into the other parts of the organization that can benefit from it. So our example there was Tesco with the demand information, the demand prediction information going back into the supply chain in a reasonably quick time. The next thing that I want to talk about now is this example that we've been working with, where we were more directly interested in changing the way that direct customers to the manufacturing site were able to find products independent of the information hierarchy that the organization already has. So this is how can a client start with any feature of a product as opposed to the navigational hierarchy that the designer might have had in mind in thinking about the information in the first place. In the case of our industry research partner, they have 11 different product lines. And if I'm interested in, purchasing something like this desk, I have to go in the current model. I start in product line A, and I look for the features that I want in a kind of a decision tree, which makes perfect sense as a manufacturer because I think in those terms. But as a client, I might find my way all the way to the bottom of the tree before I can find out if the thing comes with wheels or not. And if it doesn't, it's no good to me. So then I have to throw away that whole search, go into product line B, start going through that dichotomous key again, and get down to the point where they talk about wheels and realize, okay, it's good for wheels, but in order to get there, I found out it doesn't have the surface that I want. So then I start a third search, and I go into product line 3. So the brief they gave me, I don't know if you know this Kohler commercial. It's a kind of an amusing video that you could see on YouTube, where the man behind the desk is a design. You can see that he's a designer or an architect, and he's just walked this couple through his award-winning showroom. So he's got the models, and he's got the the trophies on the wall and so on, and he takes them up into his sophisticated office overlooking the city, and the woman that he's talking to pulls this tap out of her bag and says, "I'd like you to design me a house around this," which is, of course, a complete inversion of the normal working process for contemporary architects. But that was our brief going in as researchers to this company. They said, we would like our clients to be able to do something like that. And luckily, we had a research trajectory along these lines, because we had been for some years thinking about how to flatten out an information hierarchy and what that might mean to the people searching for it. So we had this little prototype. It's called the Mandala browser. and it consists of this circular search space. So imagine you get onto a website and you see something like this. It won't be entirely clear, but there's little dots all around the periphery. And in this case, we've got maybe 1,000 individual products that appear as these little items. And the big colored circle in the center is the search term. So we'll get this thing started up and run with this example that we were doing with the furniture people. So here we have a search term that we're going to enter, which in this case we're going to say what kind of fabrics. We want everything that comes with a fabric. I don't care whether it's a table or a chair or a wall or whatever. Does it have a fabric? Then the next one, does it have leather as an option? So I can either get it in cloth or I can get it in leather. Then the third one, can I get it in plastic? So these ones in the middle are all the ones that have fabric, leather, or vinyl as options. And then finally I say, oh, and by the way, it needs to be a chair. I'm looking for some kind of seating. So I look at that and I realize, oh, there's actually a fabric product that isn't a chair. There's sort of one left over at the top. So I click on that and it turns out, yeah, that's the fabric on one of these wall partitions. So if I'm interested now in getting a chair that's going to in some way match or not conflict with my wall, maybe I start from that wall and now work my way back into the chairs. So you can see the search process could start anywhere. It has nothing to do with the product lines unless that's a piece of information that you've already got and you're saying, oh, I want one of the slat walls of this particular product number, and you start there. But if you don't, you could start with, in this case, the materials that are involved. But equally well, you could start with the colors, you could start with a price range, any of those kinds of things. For those of you with a technical background, you'll recognize essentially what it's doing is producing a Boolean query. If you've ever written a SQL statement or an SQL statement or a regex, right, you can say, give me this and this, not this or that. But what we find is that people without a lot of computing science or mathematical training have a terrible time, and even those people have a terrible time getting the syntax of those statements right. If you've ever tried to use a search engine where you have to sort of type in the search sequence, 9 times out of 10 it's not producing what you think it's producing. Whereas in this system, you're doing it one step at a time visually, so you don't have that sense of complexity necessarily going into it. But of course, if you think of this as an information system for an organization, it's very stylized, right? It could, those colored dots could represent anything. It's not that I look at this and I think, oh, I'm looking through a whole range of furniture. I'm looking through a whole range of colored dots, and I've got to make the mental association to the idea that these are products. So then we begin to posit how this kind of visual information can be changed in order to accommodate the context of a furniture manufacturer. And we come up with this idea of the virtual design room. So here, let's take that same underlying mechanism, the kind of visual representation of the SQL query, and turn it into a 3D virtual space. So now we're going to put people, we've got some primitive sketches of this, which are actually in production in some industries, but not this one, where you basically say, okay, instead of colored dots, I've got objects of furniture. I'm sitting in this central space. I bring up a control panel. We've got these architecture and design employees, Dave and Kate. They're going to sit down in here and they're going to say, all right, give me all of the information that you've got around chairs, around furniture in general, and I only want ones that fall within this sort of tonal range of, purple, pink, red. That's the kind of palette that I'm after. Can I refine that down so that they're not I'm excluding some that aren't viable for other reasons. I get to do some things that don't have to do with the color range. I've sort of chosen, okay, it's going to be this kind of red. Now I'm going to look, does it have adjustable height for the arms? Does it have wheels on the bottom? And finally, we start to pull in other kinds of furniture. So in the same way that I was saying, well, let's match the fabric on the walls and use that as a mechanism for starting to choose the seating. You could do the same here and say, okay, now that we've got some seating, we're going to start to think about storage choices, work surfaces, all of that kind of thing, still coming out of this same browsing environment. And then again, sort of at the more technical level, there's a lot of constraint logic that goes into furniture. So within the product itself, it'll come at only a given set of heights. You know, if I want a chair that's essentially a high stool, some of the chairs won't go that high. So that's going to be a constraint for me if I want to work against a standing desk. Or the classic one, of course, it's got to fit underneath the desk. So if this chair sits too high, you won't be able to slide it under that surface. So there's the constraints within the products themselves, the intra-product constraint, and then there's the inter-product constraints. And they've got all this logic available already. It's built into the systems that they're using, but it just doesn't become available, readily available as a means for the customer to start to think about the designing of the space. So this is, again, an instance of deploying the information that the company already has, putting it into a visible form that kind of makes sense to the people doing the task, and then they can improve the way that they work because they've got that additional information. And when you think of it, there's not a whole lot of additional cost to the organization, because this isn't constraint logic that they have to build up from nowhere. They've already got it in the systems. They've already got all of the different product features available. They just don't have an information hierarchy that's been arranged in such a way that it can feed into this sort of a tool. So one of the things we were learning in this project was what it takes to search out all of the various databases that the company has and construe them in such a way that they're accessible to this kind of a tool. In our case, we work with XML primarily, so we produced a custom schema for them, and then they went to read 7 or 8 different databases, one that has the product features, one that has the constraint logic, one that has environmental impact concerns. So for instance, if you've got a table that's got some electrical circuitry in it, the standards to export it to Brazil are going to be different than the ones to Germany, than the ones to Canada. So they've got to meet all those regulatory requirements. And that's all information that's stored in a different part of the organization completely from the group that's dealing with the surfaces. So to put them all together does take some effort in terms of the information ecosystem of the organization. And at this point, all we've done is consolidate that information experimentally. Finally, you can see they start to populate the floor plan. They say, oh, it's getting close to lunch. Let's store that floor plan. We'll come back to it later. We'll close down this system, which is like our virtual contact lenses, and we'll see all of the different restaurants that are available. We'll call up our friend and see if he's interested in lunch, and we'll use this same kind of browsing room for a completely different task. What this comes down to is essentially, what would I say, visual analytics. So you've got the idea of taking the information that's inside the organization, not crunching the numbers for them and giving them an answer, but deploying that information in such a way that they can produce patterns that are then subject to their own interpretation. So you might start with the surface of the materials, like the chairs and the fabric on the walls, bring that to some other people, or sort of think about it overnight and decide, how important is it to me that the colors match, as opposed to maybe I should be thinking about textures? So having set up a browsing situation in one way, it becomes quite straightforward and easy to start to think of the alternatives that you've left out, or the interpretations that haven't been reified or embodied in the browsing that you've done up till now, and set up an alternative one that accommodates those other things. So then you would begin not with the type of fabric, but with the texture of the fabric. Or, as in the case of the environmental concerns, you might begin with the glue that holds the fabric onto the surface. So we were visiting the Piccadilly manufacturing floor last week, and one of the things that they're concerned with always is how do they bind the surface material of the shoe onto the upper in such a way that if they want to do the reverse logistics and bring the shoes back again, it can be released without too many deficits to the environment. That kind of thinking could equally well take place in the mind not of the manufacturer but of the distributor or the wholesaler or retailer. So when they're exporting to Japan, they might say, we're only interested in the shoe product lines that have the right kind of adhesive used on the uppers, and that becomes a constraint on the purchasing process. So these kind of visual environments, that's the idea, is that you're establishing a conceptual space with the visual analytics that allow people both to understand what's in the data to begin with. Do they have that kind of information about the glue? And also how the people who've designed the collection have understood it themselves. So have they created a taxonomy of glues, or do glues sit on some kind of, so there's different types laid out, or are glues set on some kind of a spectrum of ecological impact? That's important to know, not just because as the person doing the retrieval, I need to understand how the people who created the information were thinking about it. So that's one of the things that these can provide. The second is that you can think of it as what some of the researchers call machinic vision. So I'm turning on my virtual contact lens, my augmented reality glasses. I'm sitting in a room full of, where I'm surrounded by monitors, however the technology is being set up. I'm seeing things because of the information visualization or the visual analytics that otherwise would be hidden to me, either as, information in a spreadsheet or kind of raw information that hasn't been subjected to algorithmic processes that have produced those patterns. Finally, the visualization allows you this notion of comparison. It allows you to work in a kind of a seamless way. So if you think about those people sitting in their virtual room, they can move from task to task. In one case it's looking at the range of colors. In the next case it's looking at constraint logic. Those are really apples and oranges. They're not two kinds of product features. They're a type of product feature and then a type of limit on what's possible. And then they go and look at a restaurant. Right? So they use that same environment seamlessly to move between a whole variety of different kinds of tasks. You also have the advantage that it's a way of abstraction. So this is something that Celso and I are currently thinking about, and we've started some work in, and that is the notion of searching across a hierarchy of surrogates. So if I'm interested in looking at seating, for instance, the most direct way is to use words, which are a kind of a surrogate for the object, that have directly to do with seating. So I say, okay, I want it to have adjustable arms, I want it to be this fabric, I want it to have wheels. A more abstract level is to say, when I'm thinking about this room, what kind of a tone do I want to establish? What kind of an emotional environment should this lecture room be? Do I want it to be fairly formal so that people come in and they show a lot of respect for the person at the front? Do I want it to be informal so that there's going to be a lot of interaction where we'll have discussion, it'll promote discussions between us? Do I want it to be somber and serious, or do I want it to be cheerful and fun? There's these sorts of emotional attributes that associate with the human use of artifacts. So one possibility is, instead of using the direct sort of first degree surrogate in searching for chairs and saying I'm looking for this fabric or this height or these wheels, I say I'm looking for chairs that will contribute to a cheerful environment. And if I've got that data somehow in my system, it turns out that I'm searching for fun, cheerful, lively, young maybe, and I'm finding chairs by searching for emotions. So that would be a sort of a second generation surrogate in the search process. You can go further and think of maybe a third generation one. So now I've got people in my organization, and I can describe their daily behavior through instrumentation or observation. Maybe I know that Mauricio spends 80% of his day in the classroom teaching. And then he spends another 40% of his day doing research. And another 30% of his day, he's on the phone in conversations that should be private. So he's got his day kind of divided up. And Mauricio's day, of course, adds up to more than 200%. And the advantage there is I can start to aggregate Mauricio and add him in with some of his colleagues to say, here's the pattern across a whole range of people. Across the professors in our department, they will need private time on the telephone, X number of hours a week, or X percentage of the time that they're at the school. They will need meetings of more than 3 people this amount of time. They'll need dyadic conversation this percentage of the time. So then I'm essentially, in searching for chairs, I'm not searching for the attributes of the chair, I'm not searching for emotions in particular, but I'm searching for behavioral profiles of the people who will be using the thing. So I say, in creating this space, I've got to accommodate these various behavioral patterns across the faculty, and I've got to accommodate them in these percentages. So it becomes a completely different way about thinking of the design of the internal space, because you're associating this additional higher level surrogate information directly back down to the product or service. So the question immediately arises, how on earth do you do that? Emotions aren't chairs. Behavior is not a table. How do you make those connections? And there's several ways that you can do it. So in this particular project, we started from 2 different perspectives. One was the material that had been produced by the company, by the marketing division, in describing the thing that they were trying to sell. So you can read the brochure, and it's going to tell you, oh, this is a very formal product for use in legal offices or government offices at a high level. This is a very informal product for use in lounges at the university. They'll have specific terms about use and terms about emotion that have been subjectively applied by the people who've set out to describe the product for sales purposes. So we've got this kind of internal landscape of information. And then at the same time, we've got crowdsourced information. So our text mining guy went out onto Amazon, searched for particular products where we already knew how the marketers described them, and stripped out all of the language across 1,000 different Amazon comments by people who'd already bought and used the furniture. And then you could correlate and say, okay, and this is the process we're just doing now, so I can't tell you the outcome, but you can correlate what the people on the street said about it with what the marketers said about it, and find out, is there any overlap at all? Is there very good overlap? Or does the marketing not at all represent what the people are saying about it when they finally get it? And ideally, in setting up this kind of an information system where you're applying the surrogates, you can take them from these various sources. You can take them from Twitter comments, from blog posts, from places like Amazon, where the people give quite elaborate feedback often on a product that they've already purchased and used. So that's interesting, but it requires a pretty sophisticated use of technology. And luckily, one of the things that we found in this organization, I think I mentioned it later on, is they already had those skills, but in the course of examining their information ecosystem, we were able to make obvious to them that they had those skills and weren't using them. So they had staff members with a lot of work in, naive Bayesian clustering, or using support vector machines as a way of doing semi-supervised classification. But they were using these people as website designers, or, clean up the Excel spreadsheet. So it was a real mismatch between the potential of the people and what they were being asked to do. So this sort of research led not only to these kinds of thoughts about visual analytics, surrogacy and searching, but also internal, use of internal resources at the organization that were being underutilized. Finally, I think I've already touched on this, but I mentioned here Steve Ramsey's book. If any of you don't know Ramsey, it's called Reading Machines, an Introduction to Algorithmic Criticism. And what we're doing in that case is this notion of setting up patterns for subsequent interpretation. And he works in literature, so it's a kind of a different informational context. But I think the same applies for people looking for things, and also applies very strongly for designers. I think this interpretive stance is one of the key features of designers. We very seldom say, "Oh, we'll figure out the best solution to your problem." We dislike all of those words. What we'll say instead typically is, given the correct context and the set of people that are going to be using the thing, there's a variety of ways that you could approach the problem, and depending on what your interpretive priorities are, you can choose one of those to pursue. But there will be inevitably a design that is inexpensive. There will be one that is the most expensive, on that pole. There will be ones with aesthetic features that match one particular way of looking at the world, and aesthetic features that match a different one. There will be the manifest attention to detail that you want to put in. A whole range of attributes that will vary from design to design, even coming out of the same designer, same design team. So I think this idea of the visual analytics and algorithmic criticism is underdeployed so far as a kind of a theoretical way of understanding what designers are doing. So I like to advocate it. I've got just a little bit further to go. Here's some of the challenges that come up when you're trying to use visual analytics. One is that people need to know what it is that they're seeing, right? You're establishing, as a designer, a context of meaning. You're establishing the bounds of discourse of what can be included and what can be excluded. If I don't have environmental information about my products, it's not going to show up in the visual analytics. So in some instances, I need to let people know not only what's there, but also where the gaps are in my information. So that's an interesting design challenge. If you think of something like the periodic table of the elements, we did a paper some years ago where we looked at what Mendeleev had done there. And one of the interesting things is, by organizing the elements in that fashion, when you get down to the bottom of the table, you can realize there will be elements of these kinds. We just haven't found them yet. You know where the gaps are in the information that needs to be filled up. Similarly, as you're establishing that kind of discourse, it's nice to be able to provide people with that clear sense of what's going on and what they're doing. So the example in our case study is the move from the colored circles over into the virtual browsing room, where you've actually got furniture that you're looking at as opposed to these stylized objects. You also need, again, this is a reference to Ramsey, this exploratory analytics where it's not that you're coming in with some predetermined idea, but you need to get an understanding of the whole environment and start to sort through it. A lot of my work has used this phrase that's it's part of the title of that book, Rich Prospect Browsing, where the principle is you give people, for any small collection, visual representation of each item individually in the collection. So if you think of that mandala browser, we had one dot representing one item. So we had 1,000 items, we had 1,000 dots. Or we have 1,000 pieces of furniture, we have 1,000 three-dimensional representations of furniture. And then, more importantly, so that's the prospect part, but the rich part is where you say, and give people emergent tools for manipulating that information based on the metadata that's available. So if somewhere in your organization you've got environmental data, bring that environmental data into that browser and make it accessible. So that was some pretty rough sketches, but we've had a designer working for the last 3 or 4 months, Claire is her name, on a whole range of different, I think she showed us 8 or 9 different designs for these kinds of browsers just before I left Chicago. You need, in addition to these things, scale independence is nice. So you can not only look at the broad landscape, but if you want the specific details, okay, I've picked this surface. Now I may want to get all of the specifications for that surface. So that needs to be ready to hand as well. I need to be able to click on those information dots and call up the whole database of information about them. And finally, it's helpful if you can figure out ways to capture and make accessible the history of what other people have done in using these kinds of tools. So if you go onto a manufacturer site, they've got a set of pre-designed rooms that specialists in their organization have put together. So if I want to build a classroom, well, there's 10 different model classrooms that have been pre-created by someone else that I can use as a starting point. And I might say, okay, but I don't mind this arrangement, but I want a cheaper chair, or I want a more expensive chair, or I want a different, I want to use architectural glazing instead of fabrics on the walls, whatever it might be. If you've got a mechanism to capture what people are doing, you can also get the crowdsourced versions. So it's not only sort of typical arrangements that the organization has come up with, but Celso, for instance, might be producing a room design and decide, I don't need a proprietary interest in it, I can share that with other people, and then they can log in and look at what he's done. So some implications for, sort of takeaway ideas from this talk. If you've got a opportunity as a designer or as an organization that you're working with to think about the current information offering that's associated with the products or services, you can think about new ways of deploying that information, or you can think about potential new kinds of information. So the new kind of information, there's an example in collecting from Amazon the emotional descriptions of the products and bringing that back in. That's not something that the organization has had available to them previously, but it provides this potential rich opportunity for browsing by surrogates. And then, of course, strategize on how best to use those kinds of information. So first, figure out what the organization's already got as informational assets, figure out how those could be easily supplemented, and then look at ways to leverage either that existing or future information for the benefit of the organization. And I think that's a good design career. So if you're looking towards work as a designer at the kind of more strategic level of the organization, one way to do it is through attention to these kinds of information ecosystems, the development of visual analytics, especially these what I would call interpretive environments. And that's all I had to say for this morning. I hope that was interesting.